Hi, you're with the Mojo Story. I'm Barkha Dutt. The big story that we're looking at today, one we believe is not getting enough attention here in India, is what's happening in Afghanistan. Even as critical talks begin in Doha between Afghan officials and the Taliban, the United Nations is warning of a possible humanitarian crisis. This as Taliban seizes control of key areas, in particular in North Afghanistan. In fact, chilling images are coming out of the country which show Afghan troops under fire even as they seek to surrender. The media, our fraternity, is also in the line of fire, with many wondering whether free stories can still be told without journalists coming under threat. Remember, this is all happening as America is getting ready to withdraw after a failed 20-year Afghan intervention. 31st August is the D-date. In particular, what happens to women and the free press will be a point of concern for humanitarian agencies across the world. The UN Women is underscoring this fact. Girls and women were back in educational institutions, were back in professional jobs, and many believe the Taliban's archaic view of the place of women in society will be a serious matter of concern. To talk about why we should all be concerned about the rise of the Taliban and what it in fact means, we're joined by one of the premier business people and entrepreneurs from Afghanistan, also the promoter of Afghanistan's most respected television station, Tolo TV. We're joined on the program today by Saad Mohseni, who's an Afghan Australian citizen and, as I said, promotes the one television station that has really gained the respect not just of the Afghan people, but also of people from across the world. Saad, welcome to the program. And let me start by asking you, how worried are you today? We're seeing a diplomatic dialogue unveil itself in Doha, in Qatar. Is it pretty much now confirmed that we are going to see the Taliban return to a position of domination in government, or is the jury still out on that as the Americans get ready to exit?
It's obviously the situation is very fluid and can change between now and even this coming weekend when talks are due to start. As things stand today, the Taliban control perhaps the majority of districts, but not the population centers. It's very important to note that the majority of Afghans now live in our major cities. And in terms of the population centers, the government still has control over the major cities and major towns. And what the Taliban have done, and it's been obviously quite smart, is that they've captured almost all the major port cities, the towns that connect Afghanistan to Central Asia, and now to Iran, and perhaps now to Pakistan. Spin Boldak, which connects Afghanistan to Balochistan, Pakistan's Balochistan, has been under attack, and there's been fighting since last night. So let's see how that ends up. But if they're able to capture Spin Boldak, then that leaves effectively only Haratan, which connects Afghanistan to Uzbekistan, and Torkham, which connects Afghanistan to Pakhtun Khyber Khwa. So it completely chokes off the Afghan state from the outside world. And it also allows the Taliban to collect customs revenues, which is so important. And also what the Taliban have done is they've captured the major highways and freeways. So I think the idea is to choke off the major cities and then force the Afghan government to effectively do a deal that's very, very, it's obviously one that favors the Taliban.
Now, in India, we are seeing, in fact, calls to begin official or overt engagement with the Taliban. We have Qatar officials saying on record that Indian diplomats have been quietly engaging with the Taliban already in Doha. There are people here who believe that there is no alternative. How disappointed will the Afghan government, or will the Afghan people be if India begins engaging with the Taliban, basically out of a sense of pragmatism?
Well, I think Afghans will be fairly understanding because, everyone else is talking to the Taliban, whether it's the Central Asians or the Iranians and the Russians, and of course the Americans, as well as the Chinese and others, and the Europeans and Indonesians and so forth. So listen, talking is never a bad thing, as long as as long as there's a clear understanding of what you aim to achieve. If you want to engage the Taliban because it's important for India to also have an understanding in terms of what the other side wants, then that's something that they should consider. I'm not one of those people that advocates not talking to people. I think it's important to talk to people, and I think that's a reality that's probably that's dawned in Delhi, that they ought to have some sort of engagement with the Taliban. I'm not sure if Minister Jaishankar met with them when he was in Doha recently. Some people say yes, some people say no. But I suspect if they haven't already, that they will engage soon.
In that case, if there's a kind of a fait accompli to having to engage with the Taliban, where does this leave Pakistan? We saw the Pentagon make a reference to the safe havens for the Taliban inside Pakistan. But as the Taliban gets legitimacy, calling these safe havens for what the world once called a terror group, that whole discourse will change. How do you see Pakistan's role in this, in this entire situation?
Well, I mean, listen, this is a project funded and supported by Pakistan. But I think
what is a project funded and supported by Pakistan? What is?
The Taliban, the creation of the Taliban, and the assistance they've received over the years. But the safe havens, obviously, is probably the most important aspect, where the Taliban could get training, where they could take their injured, where their families have resided, and and there's evidence now that they've also had access to Iran, but it's been mostly Pakistan. But I think that there is this feeling that perhaps both the Iranians and the Pakistanis have what I would call buyer's remorse, in that they may not want to see a dominant Taliban, a sort of a belligerent, overconfident Taliban in Kabul, because that would simply mean, I think that if there's civil war and you have hundreds of thousands of refugees, both Iran and Pakistan will suffer. But also, I think this is going to embolden radical groups inside of Pakistan. If the perception is that the Taliban inside of Afghanistan was successful in pushing the Americans out, then why wouldn't the TTP, also harbor ambitions of doing the same thing in Pakistan? So I think for the Pakistanis, there are massive risks, and I think people at the senior level are certainly assessing as to what this could mean. I think the success of the Taliban over the last couple of weeks has surprised everyone on both sides of the border.
Now, in a moment from now, I'm going to play a video, courtesy one of our Twitter users, a very chilling video, which actually shows Afghan troops coming under assault, even as they're preparing to surrender to Taliban fighters. Saad, in this sort of diplomatic parlays, this thing of sitting with the Taliban across the table, have we quite forgotten the sort of completely archaic Stone Age beliefs of the Taliban? Are you not concerned what this will do, in particular, to the place of women in Afghan society? I've seen on your Twitter feed, you're underscoring how many women are now at university, how many women are now working. I know in your own television station, perhaps there was a time when you couldn't recruit women, and today that's obviously not the case. What are you most fearful about if the Taliban does return to a position of national domination in Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, I think you have to understand that the Taliban, without the ideology that they have, that they adopted in the 90s, and one that they've stuck to, is just a bunch of ordinary Afghans with long beards and turbans. That ideology is important for them. It's their raison d'être, and it's important to not forget that. And this whole idea that the Taliban have changed, I think, is a bit naive. The leadership, may say certain things that's conciliatory, that's more acceptable in Western capitals, but in reality, what we see on the ground and what we've seen over the last 20 years is something very different. The harshness is still there, and I think that they will still stop girls from going to schools. They will stop women from walking outside without a male companion, that they will be very harsh with minorities, that they would be very strict in terms of people going to the mosque and lengths of beards and so forth and so forth. So I think we just have to accept that. That's a reality we cannot, we can't sweep under the rug. And I think that there have been a lot of people who naively, I would call them like Chardonnay Taliban, who've been supportive of engaging with the Taliban, not because of the realities on the ground in terms of that we have to deal with these guys, but naively believing that the Taliban have been transformed from within. Now, the leadership may decide to actually be a little bit more flexible, but there are no guarantees that the rank and file, the commanders on the ground are going to abide by those instructions. And there's always a concern that even if there's a peace deal, even if there's an understanding that they have to change, that the group's not going to fragment.
Yeah, just to remind everybody how little the Taliban has in fact changed, Saad, I'm going to ask you to watch a video you've probably already watched. We've had to blur out the more graphic, violent images from this video. It's courtesy a Twitter user, which shows how Afghan troops preparing to surrender come under attack from the Taliban, breaking even all codes, as it were, of war and battle. Take a look.
نزن عندي ولا نزل شميك فينيو نزني مي ولي خاشكم مي وليو ده تنقى برسانية تكاكا تنقى مجاهدين كانوا تواج يو مرمي مش كده
Now that video, though chilling, is important to show to the world, Saad, because it reminds you of what the Taliban is in fact capable of. When you saw that video, what's the first thing you thought?
I wasn't surprised, and by the way, that video is a couple of weeks old. But since then, I just the last 24 hours, I've watched 3 or 4 other really chilling videos of it seems to me of killing of unarmed individuals, of people getting beaten up, of having a young boy having his arm severed in public because he had been caught stealing. So we're seeing lots of this sort of evidence, which is great for the world to see, because when you have Secretary Blinken or President Biden saying that hoping that Taliban have changed, I mean, I think this should make them realize that they're going to be dealing with a totally different Afghanistan to what they were hoping to deal with.
Tell me, is there a sense of anger with the Americans? Because it is a failed 20-year intervention. You have George Bush now saying that the withdrawal of troops is wrong. Clearly, what the Americans hoped to achieve in these 20 years, they were unable to achieve, thereby mirroring the history of every outside power that has tried to make Afghanistan its own. What is there? A sense of rage with the Americans, a sense of disappointment, or just resigned acceptance?
I think probably all of the above. I think the anger for people like us and civil society members, and I think members of the Afghan public, were angry with both the Afghan government for squandering these opportunities. The corruption and ineptitude of the state over the last 20 years has probably allowed groups like the Taliban to re-emerge. That's one. I think it's an important point to make. But the other important thing is that the Americans have left us the way that it's not a question of we can't ask the Americans to stay there forever, but it's just the way that they left. For example, the Afghan military has been created in the mold of the U.S. military, heavily reliant on contractors for the maintenance and servicing of equipment, of all things, logistics and so forth. And those things were just pretty much, taken down. I mean, and destroyed before they left. The Americans have essentially left with the contractors, and they had no transition in terms of allowing the Afghans to take over that really important aspect of maintaining their aircraft and other equipment and their vehicles. So all of a sudden, if you look at the inventory for the Afghan Air Force, there's not much in terms of parts. The contractors are not there to fix planes or vehicles. We don't have a proper logistics system in terms of distribution of ammunition. But the Americans have had 20 years to figure out what this transition would look like. Why couldn't they have a plan to transition this to the Afghan side? And why leave so quickly? The other thing which I think is important is that Afghanistan, despite its flaws, as far as the state's concerned, and despite the flaws of the military and so forth, things were falling into place. It was going to take a bit more time. The people called this a stalemate, and then the Economist had a good editorial the other day that the stalemate to the Americans was precious to the Afghans, because we had peace in the country, and that young girls could still go to school, people could still express themselves. It was a period that we could continue to develop, and it was just going to be a question of time before we were going to get to a level where we could do things for ourselves. And I think that the way that this rug was pulled from under our feet is the reason why I think a lot of people feel so disappointed. Not necessarily the decision, but the way that it was executed.
Now, we saw this fantastic interview done by one of the presenters at Tolo TV with the Pakistan Foreign Minister Saad Mohseni, where the anchor is very quietly and deftly able to trap Mr. Qureshi in his own rhetoric. You've called the Taliban a Pakistan project. Do you believe that Pakistan has gained leverage from these developments? And to that extent, there is talk now of a resurgent Pakistan, China, maybe even Iran axis as a countervailing force to the Indians and Americans in this region.
Well, the Pakistanis have always had leverage with the Taliban, whether it's advising them or providing them with sanctuaries or hospitals or even, safe havens for their family members. The question is, will they maintain that leverage? That's one. Will the Taliban listen? Once they're back inside of Afghanistan, a regime that doesn't necessarily believe in anything except just holding on to power, they may decide not to listen to the Pakistanis as much as they are today. As far as China and Pakistan, as well as Iran, are concerned, I think they will try to, they'll be pragmatic, but at the same time, I think that people are going to be seriously concerned, including the Chinese, because a group that it exists because of that ideology, how could they not allow foreign fighters to be based out of Afghanistan? That ideology is the thing that allows it to prosper and to survive. And I think even now we're getting a lot of information about not just Chinese, but as well as Chechen, Central Asian, and Arab fighters fighting alongside the Taliban today. Pakistanis as well, of course, lots of Pakistanis. Now, they will again decide, they may decide to turn a blind eye, because what's the worst case scenario? The Americans will invade again and we will beat them. So whatever fear factor there was in the late 90s doesn't exist anymore. So I think I think that this whole idea that, it'll take 2 years for Al-Qaeda to regroup and so forth is not true. Al-Qaeda is in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda is active. They have an understanding of the Taliban. And there are hundreds of other groups. I don't understand. I think that we should be very mindful of labels and names. To me, it's the idea that's alive.
And the exit of the Americans, as you said, has robbed them of fear. They know now that they have defeated the Americans almost.
They have. Well, the Americans have certainly have allowed them to come, to go with the narrative that we've beaten the Americans, the way that they've scrambled and have abandoned and exited Afghanistan. And Biden's, 2 speeches, you think the guy would be a little bit more responsible, would have some shame and some honor to at least not speak about the Afghans the way he has been speaking about the Afghans. He wants to talk about fun things. What about the 35 million Afghans who are like prisoners inside their own country at the mercy of this group called the Taliban?
So you're saying Biden has shown no shame or compassion?
None.
Do you want to elaborate on that? Because, people had an opinion of Trump, and Trump was the man who initiated the deal or the talks with the Taliban. And now you're saying for Joe Biden, who was considered perhaps more liberal, and therefore perhaps there were more expectations of him, that Joe Biden has no shame when it comes to the Afghan people.
None. He has no honor, no shame, no conscience. And he was part of this government of the government from 2008 onwards, 2009 onwards, for 2 terms, where they made promises. They had made pledges to the Afghan nation, to the women of Afghanistan, and of course since 2001 successive U.S. governments have made all sorts of promises and pledges to the Afghan nation. The Afghan government, I understand, it's corrupt, it's inept, all those things. But what about the Afghan people? When you make that promise to a young girl, you can go to school and America will have your back, or you talk to a civil society member that freedom of expression is important to not just the world, but mostly to the Americans, and we will help, we will support you, we will be by your side, and then to just cut and run like this is something that's deeply disappointing. And bad things will happen in Afghanistan. We will have a refugee problem. People will get executed. Women will be treated like third-class citizens. And this is going to be on Biden first and foremost.
Yeah. Sorry.
Well, Biden owns what will follow. It's going to be on him.
What is the expectation of India at this point?
I'm not sure. I think everyone is scrambling to figure out what's going to happen next. Like you said, there's fighting. There's perhaps peace negotiations will start in earnest this weekend in Doha, led by a pretty senior delegation. My suspicions are that the Taliban have got the upper hand, and I think they may demand almost a surrender deal of sorts, disguised as a peace deal. Now, it's up to the political establishment to figure out what's in the interest of the Afghan nation, and of course, it's not going to be quick, and it may take some time. But for the Afghan people, I think we're just as confused, and I think so is the region. We're not sure what's going to transpire in the next couple of weeks in terms of both the fighting and the peace talks, and I think the Indians, like everyone else, will be watching. And also the Afghans are scrambling. The Afghan government is scrambling, trying to figure out who's going to fill the vacuum once the Americans leave.
Finally, what does this mean for journalism in Afghanistan? As a media mogul, as someone who promotes a television station, what do you think it means? Let's not forget how many journalists have sacrificed their lives in the telling of the Afghan story, in particular Afghan journalists who have aided foreign correspondents from the world. Over 51 journalists killed in Afghanistan since 2001, and I'm sure many more vulnerable every day.
Well, a quarter of those journalists were killed were our journalists. We've lost 13 journalists since 2016, have had dozens injured, maimed, and handicapped. It's not good. It's not good. I think the Taliban is a pretty unforgiving, very belligerent movement. So even if they come as part of a coalition government, if they agree on some sort of a peace deal, we cannot see this environment remaining the way what we've enjoyed over the last 20 years in terms of expressing ourselves or reporting on things. And if they take over the state completely, then of course there's no hope for any media organization. But that's not to say that we cannot remain active, even if there's 5 centimeters of Afghanistan where we can operate from. We will continue to operate, and we will also try to continue work even in Taliban areas, and we've spoken to the Taliban. We're not going to give up that easily, but it's going to become more and more difficult.
What keeps you awake at night when you think of what may happen to your country?
I think first and foremost the lives of our journalists and and our employees. We have 400 or 500. Their well-being, their families, but also just the future of this country. I think this country. I know it probably was difficult to see from the outside, but there was a great deal of hope. 60% of the population is under the age of 20 or 25. These people have never seen. They have never experienced a Taliban-type regime in most of the country. So for them, it's going to be a big shock. I think a big psychological shock. There's risk to life, but there's risk to mental well-being as well. For them to actually live under the Taliban, it's going to be a real test for them all.
Yeah, very difficult situation. And as you remind us, what happens in Afghanistan next actually impacts the entire world. It isn't only about Afghanistan. And even if it were only about Afghanistan, that doesn't mean that the Americans did not have a moral duty there to the Afghan people. Saad, thank you. We hope to be on the ground in Afghanistan next month. And we thank you in particular through you for the courage of the Afghan media and the Afghan journalists, who I think have done such a courageous job at great risk to their lives to bring the story of Afghanistan to the world. I know foreign correspondents would be nowhere without their local colleagues in Afghanistan. Saad Mohseni, thank you. We'll bring you back as the story develops further. It's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Barkha.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.